So someone just posted a meme about I think it was LA, two fascists who got caught on video. They didn't know they were getting caught on video. The best I can tell, they were pulling over somebody for riding a bicycle while wearing headphones. The person, I think, tried to flee a little bit. They tackled him. In the struggle to get the handcuffs on, it looks like one fascist shot the other fascist by accident, because it turned out the bullet came from the fascist gun. And then, in response to that, they decided to plant the gun on the handcuffed guy on the ground and shoot him to death, and didn't know that it was being video recorded. Um, so that's some lovely protecting and serving going on there. Um, and people commented under it, and I posted my video, when should you shoot a cop? And I pointed out, yeah, this is when you should shoot a cop. When they just blatantly commit murder. If you're there and shooting them would stop them from committing murder, please shoot the cops. Um, and but it occurred to me, a thing I've said in different ways at different times, but I haven't often said it this way. The only real world limitation on government is the ability and willingness of the people to shoot cops. And by itself, that sounds, oh, it's outrageous, but it's just a statement. It's not even advocacy. And here's the reason. I mean, imagine you're in a situation where you're given power over somebody, and their only recourse is to ask you nicely to not do it. Like, a master-slave relationship. Well, I own you. You're my property. I can whip you. I can work you as hard as I want. I can do whatever. You're allowed to beg me to be nicer, but ultimately it's my choice. So who cares? Like, your petitions aren't anything. And I love how people do political action. They say, we have to demand that our representatives do this. And I say, what do you mean demand? You are misusing the word demand. You have no power to demand. Like, or else. What's the or else? If you don't immediately fix this horrible injustice, then what? You're going to wait 4 years and vote for somebody just like them and probably lose anyway, and they'll still be there. That's not a demand. Like, if you have no power to do anything, you can't demand anything. And political action is no power to do anything. And a demand, like a command, as in the imperative tense, you have to do that. Like, it's just a request unless you can inflict some rather unpleasant consequences for disobedience. That's just the statement of reality, regardless of whether your demand is good or bad or justified or whatever. You can't demand anything if you have no power to enforce it. You can whine and bicker and beg, but that's not the same thing. We demand justice, say the protesters, and they don't get it. And then what happens? Nothing. Because it's not backed up by anything. There was no threat. They had no ability to do anything if the masters choose to ignore them. Like a slave saying, don't whip us so hard. Really? What are you going to do if I don't? Like, you can ask, you can beg, you can petition, you can plead, but you're not demanding anything. You're in no position to demand anything. And when it comes to government, because everything government does is by force, every law is just a threat of violence, there is no demand to stop it, and there really is no deterrent outside the fear of death for fascists and for politicians too. And I'm not saying this is what we have to do. I'm just describing the nature of the situation, which is, because somebody's saying, like, why does this keep happening, and why don't cops get prosecuted and stuff for murder like this? Every once in a blue moon one will get convicted, but mostly it hardly ever happens. And I said, well, duh, when the referee works for one team, don't expect a fair outcome. And when the referee works for the other team, only the other team, if it has the ability to force justice, that's the only way justice is going to happen. If you're up against somebody and the somebody is the dispute resolution between the two of you, and that's the nature of government, that's not you're not on equal footing. Duh. I know I'm stating the bleeding obvious here, but people actually think, well, I'll take you to court or I'll file a petition or like you're going to the government to complain about the government. You actually think they're going to care more about you than they do about themselves. It really is like you get into an argument with your neighbor and then you say, all right, that's it. I want this dispute resolved by your brother who lives in the same house. He gets because I'm sure he'll be unbiased. And so if you look from the vantage point of the control freaks, the only like how much do you think they care if you bicker and moan at them? Like they're controlling you, they're demanding money from you, they're robbing you blind by way of taxes, they're threatening you with violence every time they issue a law. For you to say, we don't like this, like, do you think they care if you like this? Duh. I'm pretty sure most people understand that if they violently dominate other people, their victims aren't going to like it. The people who violently dominate other people don't care that their victims don't like it. Duh. Like if a rape victim, an intended rape victim says, I don't want this, you think the rapist is going to go, oh, I thought you did. Sorry, my mistake. He knows that. Just the way government knows that people don't want to be violently subjugated. That's why they need law enforcers, because people don't want it to happen. At least some people don't want it to happen, and those people will be forcibly dominated. And so from their perspective, obviously, they don't give a crap that you don't like it. They send men with guns after you to make you obey. Like, how much do you think they care whether you like it? And so the equation, morality is out of the equation. They don't care about morality. They don't care what you want. They don't care about your rights. They don't care about freedom. They don't care about any of the BS that they talk about, that they pretend to care about. They see you as their subject. And if you disobey, they send men with guns to punish you. The only thing people like that care about is danger to themselves. Like if they might accidentally pay for their crime. It's like some sociopath or even just a common criminal who has no respect for property or anything else. Like he still doesn't want to get his head blown off. So you're probably not going to talk a carjacker out of carjacking you. Hey man, this is immoral. You shouldn't take my car. It's mine. Probably not going to have a great success rate with that. But if you let him know, I'm going to kill you if you keep trying to take my car, he will change his ways because he doesn't want to die. And that is the entire equation of government. That is the only limitation on government, is when people in government fear that somebody's going to kill them. And that is the only reason that there hasn't been, that's basically this country isn't completely totalitarian. It's not because we can vote. All the, USSR, Red China, North Korea, they're allowed to vote. It's not because we have a constitution. They had those. It's not because we have a Bill of Rights. They had those. And they all charged towards totalitarianism. It is because 100 million Americans have guns, which means at some point there is that limitation on what the tyrants can get away with. It's why they can't just throw out the facade of consent of the governed and representative government and all that BS and just say, well, now we're going to rule by brute force. Because they know that in a contest of brute force, the government loses very quickly and very badly and very violently. And so they have to keep up the facade that'll keep most people not resisting. And as long as most people will just bitch and moan and vote and petition and stuff, the tyrants don't care. They know, okay, those are the good slaves. They will do as they're told. They might bitch and moan about it on occasion, but what do we care? They'll still do as they're told. They'll still be our slaves, and they won't get uppity, and they won't run away, and they won't fight back. So we can, we don't care if they sit there whining at us every once in a while, because we have nothing to lose. And that's the position of a sociopath. You don't give him something to lose by explaining how you don't want him to hurt you. He doesn't frickin' care. He doesn't care that you don't want that. So ultimately, the only real world limitation on government is when people will violently resist. And, that makes people really uncomfortable. And that's sort of the point of my video, When Should You Shoot a Cop? is that people go, oh, you should never do that. Well, if you think you should never do that, then, welcome to the fast track towards totalitarianism. Imagine if government took a poll and 100%, every single person in the country said, oh, you should never, ever shoot a cop. You should never forcibly resist law enforcement. What do you think that would tell them? It means we can do absolutely anything we want. We don't have to keep up the charade of elections and constitutions and due process. We can do whatever we want. They just said at no point will they ever resist. They bitch and moan, who cares? In fact, we don't even care if they vote. We won't let them vote anymore. Not that it did anything before anyway. But cool. They've just acknowledged that they will knuckle under no matter what we demand of them, no matter what we command them to do, no matter what we do to them, including, get on the cattle cars, whatever evil crap we want to do. They've just all agreed and proudly stated that at no point will they resist, actually forcibly resist. This would have been a totalitarian country many, many years ago, if not for all the potential cop killers in it. Incidentally, this is one of the reasons that I haven't fled the U.S. For places that are less fascist, because there are places less fascist, because I do still think there are more radical troublemakers willing to disobey here than there are in almost any other country, maybe other than in any other country. And that doesn't mean they're anywhere near a majority of the population. But in other places, it's sort of a more timid government, but everyone just goes along and nobody resists and whatever. Like, theirs are fairly stable or more slowly crawling towards totalitarian control. Basically, they may be better human livestock managers in that they enslave their people in a way that doesn't cause rebellion and doesn't cause instability. And meanwhile, the U.S. tyrants are like charging for totalitarian control. But in the end, it just comes down to that, and it makes everybody really uncomfortable when you talk about it that way, even though it's just obviously true. If there's someone who thinks he has the right to violently dominate you, and he knows at no point will you ever resist, like, how do you think he's going to treat you? But if you say, look, I don't like what you're doing to me, at some point, I have a gun and I'm going to shoot you if you try to do something nasty enough to me, then he'll at least be careful. Well, first thing is he'll try to think up an excuse to disarm you. Why do you think they talk about gun control all the time? Because they don't want people to have the means to defend themselves. Because if they didn't have the means, who cares if they have the willingness? People say, well, I would have resisted if I had the means to, but I don't, so oh well. But a sociopath attacking somebody, if the somebody openly said, like, I'm a pacifist, I would never fight back, great, you're the sociopath's dream come true. You just let him know that he has nothing to lose and nothing to fear by attacking you and victimizing you and doing whatever the hell he wants, because you're not going to fight back. And you just said so. You just bragged about it. You just bragged about the fact that you're a completely helpless victim who won't even defend himself from completely immoral aggression. And that's most Americans. Anybody who says, oh, you should never shoot a cop, in response to like the question in my video, is basically saying we should never resist tyranny. At the same time, nobody actually means it. And it's really easy to demonstrate that. You ask a couple questions like, well, what if, what about in the days of slavery? Or what if you were in Nazi Germany? Well, in those cases, then you should resist the law. But here, it's a democratic republic, and they spout the mythology, and then I have to explain to them, yeah, those are all democratic republics too, with constitutions and Bill of Rights. And then they flounder around and look for a different excuse. But really, my whole purpose in making the video, when should you shoot a cop, is to start people thinking about that. Like, is there any point at which I will resist, or will I let them do absolutely anything to me they damn well please? Because that's the only other choice. Either at some point you pull out a gun and resist, or a pitchfork, or whatever you happen to have. Guns are rather convenient for the purpose. But at some point you would either say, yeah, this is too much, this is the line I'm drawing, you can't do this to me without me resisting. Or you say, nope, there's no line, you can do anything you damn well please. Those are the only two options. And the When Should You Shoot a Cop video, and the article that it came from, it doesn't even try to like answer for everybody. It just tries to get people to think about that. Like, is there any point at which you would say, yeah, this is too far. We're not going along with this. And it's pathetic to watch the voters and the protesters say, this is too far. Now we're going to go out and protest. Like, and then what? Like, you think they care? What indication is there that they care whether you go and whine at them in the street? Like, they have lots of guns. As long as they think you're not going to resist, they'll do whatever the hell they want. In fact, while you're whining in the street, they'll go pepper spray you in the face, knowing that you're not going to do anything about it because you're still in slave mentality and still all you can think of to do is whine to the masters to be nicer to you. That's exactly what they want. And it's why they preach like I just did a rant about, the virtue of helplessness. Oh, I'm above all that violence. I'm a totally helpless victim who cannot and will not ever defend myself against aggression from the state. Like, whoop-de-doo, that is not something to be proud of. You're a pathetic, helpless slave. Way to go. But people don't like to think in such simple, literal terms to realize, look, the government, that's how it functions too. And people know this. I mean, you don't have to think that they're all diabolical sociopaths to grasp this simple fact. Like, all right, they can raise taxes, they can lower taxes, they can do whatever they want with taxes. If you whine at them to not raise taxes, does that stop them? No. You can point to every election in this country in the past bazillion years to demonstrate that when people say, we don't want higher taxes, they get higher taxes anyway. When they say, we demand that you repeal this, and they don't repeal it, nothing happens. When they say, hey, why are you giving billions of dollars to huge corporations in this bailout? We don't like that. And the politicians do it anyway, and nothing happens to them. And so there's no reason to expect those in power to care. Oh, and there was that study. Who just did that? When you break it down by income level, the vast majority of voters, it has no effect on what government does or doesn't pass, what they legislate, what they tax, any of that. And they did this nice study and made a cool little video that demonstrates they all the way don't at all care what you want. And I don't know how they could be any more clear about that. Now, if you're among the billionaires who can give them money and bribe them and who basically own the system anyway, then they will pretend to care what you want because you're buying their influence and they get enriched by way of the arrangement. So that's when they'll pay attention. And the only time they'll pay attention to money is if you have a ridiculous amount of it and you're basically bribing them to leave you alone, not to leave everyone else alone. Because if a billionaire say, hey, I'll give you tons of campaign money if you'll stop robbing everybody else, none of the politicians would go for that. Because they all want the power over their fellow man, but they will give an exception for their billionaire buddies who bribe them to do certain things or to leave them alone. Go harass and rob the rabble instead of the important people like me. But people don't want to admit what they already know, which is that their vote doesn't matter, their petitions don't matter, the people in Congress don't care what they think, and they will pass legislation and enforce legislation whether the majority wants it or not. They've only done that about a bazillion times. So it's just a matter of people not wanting to think things through and realize, wow, the only limitation isn't constitutions, it's not elections, it's not petitions, it's not any of that. It's just that if they went too far, they'd trigger a revolution. They'd trigger a violent backlash. That's the only limitation. That's the only thing that actually matters in this equation. It's like, all right, how many feathers do you have to put on this scale to counter this piano? Way more than you will ever have. Like, we'll have an anvil. Okay, a bunch of anvils will pretty quickly even out a piano. Like, if the piano is government power and your petition is a feather, it doesn't freaking matter. And it doesn't matter how many you put on. Well, we have 1,000 feathers. Well, you put them all on, they make exactly no difference. and the piano knows it. Realize anthropomorphizing a piano analogy got a little out of control. But all the feathers together add up to nothing. That's no disincentive for them to be control freaks. You need an anvil, and an anvil is the threat of violent reaction and violent resistance to the freaking control freaks. That's the only thing they care about. And so when people whine about, there has to be accountability in the police, why the hell would there be? Why on earth would you imagine that there is ever going to be accountability when all the incentive is for them to be control freak thieves, and there is no incentive for them not to be because their victims aren't shooting them yet? Well, not very often. And so people just don't want to admit that. Oh, and I'll close with this. People say, well, without government, it would be might makes right. Well, it's not might makes right, it's might makes outcome. And that's what we have with government. Government does everything by way of threats. It passes laws and it threatens you if you disobey. If you don't threaten back, it's totally lopsided. It's a shutout. And I'm not saying you should threaten back. On a practical basis, it might be good to not die or get caged. But that's not a negotiation. If they threaten and you say, come on, don't threaten me with that, like, they win. There's no threat in the other direction. It's a piano against a feather. And that's why the only thing they actually fear is violent resistance. So they like it when they see people protesting and whining and petitioning, because they realize, all right, that group of people is no threat because they still think that bitching at us is the proper recourse. Cool. A slave who keeps working in the fields and bitches at us at the end of the day, well, no problem with that. As the slave master, I don't care. He's still doing what he's doing. It's the ones that get all quiet and give me nasty looks that I might start worrying about, because when I whip them, they might just decide to frickin' kill me. And that's an actual deterrent. And that's the only deterrent to government, is the threat of violence in the other direction. Because everything government does is violence. And if there is no violence in the other direction, obviously the result is lopsided. There's no disincentive for them to do what they do, or be totalitarian, or be total control freaks. But most people just don't want to think about that, and they don't want to talk about the fact that it's not, well, we have to fix this, or we might have to vote, or petition, or something, or sue them, or something. No, the choices are it'll get really, really, really bad and worse and worse and worse, or we shoot them at some point. That's the only real choice that matters. At what point will you forcibly resist? The Frederick Douglass quote sums it up perfectly. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Find out just what the people will submit to, and you found out the exact amount of injustice which will be inflicted on them. Submit to, go along with, not resist. It's only when people get to the point where they will actually resist. Voting is not resisting, petitioning is not resisting, whining is not resisting. When people will actually resist, that is the only check against increasing government power. Which is why I want people thinking about that stuff, which is why I write things like, when should you shoot a cop? So people can start to think, well, is there any point at which I would say, yeah, screw you, I'm not playing that game? Or would I just roll over and let them do whatever they want? So, yeehaw. So yeah, really the only limit on any government ever, and if you compare the constitutions of tyrannical regimes all over the place, including in the U.S., Bill of Rights doesn't friggin' work. Like, it's not backed by anything. Like, oh, a piece of paper says we're not allowed to do this to you. Wham! I did it to you anyway. What are you going to do? Whine about it. Okay. That's not a deterrent. I'm going to point to the piece of paper that says you weren't supposed to. Guess how much they give a crap. So in the Bill of Rights, the only thing that matters to me is the Second Amendment, and it isn't because government gives us permission. It's because even statists think they still have the right to have guns, but if they're not willing to use it to resist, that's kind of worthless too. But the only real-world limitation on any bully is the ability and willingness of his intended victims to fight back. And that's true of government just as much as a schoolyard bully. So, and I talk about it to make people uncomfortable, because people kind of need to think about these things before we're completely totalitarian. So, all right, so that is my rant for today. I'm going to say some things today that are going to anger a lot of people and offend a lot of people and probably make lots of people go, yay! But I'm pretty sure you won't be bored. 233 years ago, a bunch of guys got together right over there, and they wrote a letter to their king. And it was a very well thought out, very eloquent letter, but it basically boiled down to this. Dear King George, you're not the boss of us. Sincerely, bunch of troublemakers. Because that's essentially what the Declaration of Independence was. It was not whining to the king, oh, will you please be nice and lower your taxes and do this. In fact, the Declaration specifically describes how they had tried that and it didn't work. Now, for all the parades and celebrations and picnics and fireworks that are going to go on today across this country, all the millions of people engaged in this celebration, how many of them actually think about what the Declaration of Independence was? What those people did? Those people were criminals. They were tax cheats. They were traitors. They looked their government, the British Crown, in the face and said, we do not acknowledge your right to rule us at all. They did not say, will you please reduce this and please be nicer here. They said, it's over. Truth be told, some of the colonists were cop killers. If you don't believe me, what do you think happened at Lexington when King George's law enforcers said, you colonists, lay down your guns? They said, no, you're not the boss of us. And so we had the shot heard around the world, which is widely regarded as the beginning of the American Revolution. How many people celebrating across this country today actually support that kind of radical, extremist action and attitude that you can go to your own government and say, we're not going to obey you anymore. We do not acknowledge your right to rule us at all ever again. Personally, I doubt it's very many Americans. We have lots of sort of residual freedoms left over from what a bunch of radicals did a long time ago, and it's sort of fun to be this close to where some very significant steps in that happened. But the bad news is the spirit that allowed this country is basically dead in the vast majority of Americans. The vast majority of Americans are absolutely incapable of thinking, much less speaking, the concept, you're not the boss of me. Now, when we look back, it's easy for us to cheer, hooray for the rebels, and we know how it turned out. We know they won. We know the revolution was successful, and King George got his butt kicked. So we can say, yay, yay, hooray. But make no mistake, when you cheer for the people who had the American Revolution, you are cheering for traitors and criminals. They broke the law. Freedom is always illegal. Let this one thing sink in. If you don't hear anything else, freedom is always illegal because the people who want power over you will always say, keeping what you earn is against the law. Being armed is against the law. Determining your own future is against the law. And how many Americans, as much as they celebrate Independence Day, are capable of even thinking those thoughts? Let's do a comparison. Suppose a group in this country today did what the founders did 233 years ago. Suppose they wrote a letter to the United States government, a letter to Congress and the president, and said, we will not pay your taxes ever again. We will not obey your laws ever again. We do not acknowledge your right to rule us at all ever again. And when you send your thugs to enforce your will on us, we will resist. How many Americans dare to even think that?
And what would most Americans think of any group that did that? Horrible criminals and traitors and fringe lunatics, and we can't have that. Well, why do we have this double standard? Why is the whole country having these huge celebrations over Independence Day where a bunch of criminals broke the law, committed treason, and resisted authority, when the vast majority of all those people out there having celebrations would be the first in line to condemn anyone who did that today? Why the double standard? Did morality change sometime in the last 233 years? In short, the spirit of resistance, the ability to say, "You're not the boss of me," is gone from the vast majority of American culture. It has been trained out of us. And for all the pride people express today, I'm here to tell you, the American people are wimps. And why is that? It's not just bad luck. It's not a coincidence. For years and years and years, the churches, the schools, the media, the government, society in general has taught us one rule above all else. Obedience to authority is the highest virtue, and disobedience is the worst sin. That is the message that comes through everything else. And you can see it. Here's where I'm going to offend a lot of people. You can see it in the freedom movement. Because the vast majority of the freedom movement consists of people saying, let's vote for these people, let's push for this legislation, let's lobby for this and that and the other thing. And they couch their demands in, of course, we will only do things within the system. We would never advocate anything illegal. Well, I hate to spoil your party, but the Declaration of Independence was not about doing something within the system. It was about saying, we're free whether authority says so or not, and we will resist. Even if you call it law, even if you call yourself government, even if you wear fancy hats and have big, important meetings, we will resist because we own ourselves. So how many people advocate that now? Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, where are they in the mainstream? They're not there. There's a few fringe wackos like me and a bunch of people I see here. But these people that get revered all across the country as being these great heroes of the American Revolution, the people who cheer for them do not believe what those men believed in. They believed in something called unalienable rights. That means you have a right to do something. If the law says you can't do it, you still have the right to do it. If the government says you can't do it, you still have the right to do it. Unalienable means nothing anyone in the world can do takes away your right to do that. Now they can infringe on that right, which they do on a regular basis. They can stomp on you and they can hurt you and they can punish you, but it will never be legitimate. And nobody should ever bow. Sorry, I hear thunder here. It's fake thunder, don't worry. That nobody should ever bow to someone who says, well, no, we had these elections and these processes and this and that and the other thing. Now I have the right to infringe on this and that and the other thing. Nothing gives them the right. That's what unalienable means. But Americans, by and large, do not believe that. Now, some people, every once in a while, will say, well, it was really oppressive back in 1776, and we're just not quite to that point yet. If 2 to 3% taxation justified a revolution in 1776, why doesn't 50% and growing justify a revolution? If a few little excise taxes on pieces of paper and tea justified open lawlessness from these rebels that we're all celebrating, why don't the myriad of incomprehensible, unavoidable, crushing taxes, state, local, and federal, why don't they justify a revolution today? If the occasional abuse of the colonists by the redcoats justified a revolution back then, why isn't it justified today by the fact that the vast majority of American law enforcement see no problem at all with randomly stopping you, detaining you, interrogating you, and searching you for any reason they like or no reason at all? If you read the Fourth Amendment, you realize, wow, they had a revolution over that. So where's the spirit? With all the flag waving and with all the celebrating, where are the people who actually believe in what happened right over there 233 years ago? What exactly are we proud of if we let that go? People talk about American pride. What is it they're proud of? That reminds me, somebody gave me a note here to read you. The guy's name was Samuel Adams. Yeah, the beer guy, but he did some other stuff too. If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. So what happened? Why did this nation lose its ability to say, you're not the boss of me? Even among people who say we're the most ardent supporters of freedom, if you say, are you willing to break the law? They say, no, 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 I would never do that. In other words, you're ardent advocates of freedom as long as the tyrants give their permission. That's not being advocates of freedom. In Lexington, what happened when the troops said, lay down your guns? Did they say, can't we keep them pretty, please? Okay, here you go. No, they said no. Where are the Americans capable of saying no? I'm not talking about voting and whining to your congressman. I'm talking about resistance. And I know even hearing about this makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, because the American people do not believe what the Founding Fathers believed. The problem is we have been trained for years and years and years to measure our worth based on how well we obey authority. Not on how we treat other people, not on what we produce, on how well we obey authority. Consider the example of the phrase, law-abiding taxpayer. People use that constantly, and what they mean when they say, I'm a law-abiding taxpayer, is, I'm a good person. Okay, but what does law-abiding taxpayer actually mean? Well, the law-abiding means you do what the politicians tell you. Now, as much as we revere the law, and we talk about those nasty lawbreakers and those great law-abiding citizens, and we talk as if the law is some proclamation from on high, we know who writes them. They're a bunch of liars and crooks. Does anybody not know that the politicians are a bunch of liars and crooks? So why is it that when they say you have to do this, you're not allowed to do that, we call it law and we bow to it like it came down from on high? It's the commands of crooks, but we have been trained to view it as the measure of whether we are good people. Let's consider a few examples. Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had a whole lot of law-abiding taxpayers who went along with the agenda of the Third Reich and who funded it. Were they the good guys? Nope. The good guys in Nazi Germany were the criminals, the people who said, what you're doing is illegal. I will disobey your laws and I will not pay your taxes. Same thing under Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Castro, you can go right down the list. It's a really long list. The good people were not the people who were law-abiding taxpayers. The good people were the people who said, I am not going to help those people wearing the label of government to oppress and injure and murder my fellow man. If they call that law, I am proud to be a criminal. And as much as we revere the law, if you need politicians telling you what's right and wrong, something's horribly wrong. Here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson, because I just want to let you know I'm not the first radical wacko to say these sorts of things. Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. So what about right here? We can look at lots of other times, lots of other places and say, hooray for the people who broke the law. We can look back in this country's history when slavery was legal. Just as evil, but it was legal. Were the good guys the people who went along with it? Nope, the good guys broke the law. And we can see that in this country, in the past, and lots of other countries, present and past. What about this country today? Do we really want to tell ourselves that, well, no, it's not okay to resist now? Among other things. When people feel this moral obligation to obey the law, they speak it as if it's some proclamation from on high. What exactly is your moral obligation? To work really hard so you can give thousands of dollars to Obama so he can give them to international bankers? Where is the moral obligation?
Nowhere.
Where is the moral obligation to fund whatever war any politician happens to say, hey, I bet if I do that, it'll help my image? Why do we believe we have a moral obligation to obey whatever they call law? Here's a radical thought. You have a moral obligation to recognize and honor the rights of every individual on the planet, no matter what the law says. And do we all feel a moral obligation to finance the police state we see growing up all over the place? Trouble is, we've forgotten a very important secret. And the founders, a bunch of them referenced it, but even they didn't seem to fully grasp it. Here it is. I have to say it quietly. It's a secret. You own yourself. Oh, you've heard that secret?
And this country.
You own yourself. Now, when I say that to almost anybody, they say, well, of course I do.
And the country.
Are you sure you think that? Yeah, of course I do. Of course I own myself. So you own your time and effort. Yeah. So what you produce with your time and effort, no one has the right to take that from you by force without your consent, right? Oh, of course not. What if they call it taxes? Oh, that's different. No, it's not. It is not different. If you own yourself, someone calling himself government, someone calling his demands laws and taxes or anything else, it is still theft. And there are some radical wackos in history like Frederick Bastiat who did a great job of explaining that obvious truth, a truth that is completely lost on the vast majority of Americans. And I could go down the list for ages, which I'm not going to do. If you own yourself, would you have to pay rent for the property you already bought? No. What if it's called property taxes? If you own yourself, doesn't that imply, and if you have the right to life, liberty, and property, they changed the last one to happiness because it sounded more poetic. Initially, it was going to be life, liberty, and property, because property is essential to freedom. If I can't make something and own it myself, then what good is my time worth to me if it doesn't belong to me? So back when it was called life, liberty, and property, if you have the right to those things, doesn't that sort of imply you have the right to defend those things against all aggressors? What if the aggressors say, well, we're government and this is law? You know, everybody can see if some thug comes to your house and points a gun at you and says, hand it over because I want it, then it's perfectly okay to defend yourself. But if they call it government and they call it law and they call it taxes, suddenly everyone's perception drastically changes. Suddenly, the guy who produced it, who says, wait, I produced this, I want to keep it, he's the evil, nasty, greedy criminal. and the thug pointing a gun at him to say, nope, sorry, goes to the politicians, he's the noble law enforcer. When did our perception of reality get so messed up? Now, I'm going to finish it up here. Hope I riled up enough people already. The concept of freedom and being able to defend your liberty sort of implies you have the right to have the ability to defend your liberty. Now, I have an email list, and a while ago I sent a thing to the list that says, I want every American to have the ability to forcibly resist federal agents. As you may expect, it freaked out some people who work over there. And I suspect it would freak out most of the country. What are you talking about? You want people to have the ability to kill law enforcers? Is that what you're saying? Yep. I'm not saying go out and slaughter them wildly. I'm saying you should have the ability. And 233 years ago, some guys explained why and demonstrated why you should have that ability. But as scared as people are of that concept, what's the alternative? That you should not have the ability to resist your own government. Which of those scares you more? Because I got to tell you, the idea of a people incapable of protecting itself from its own government, that's really scary to me. You have one obligation as human beings, and it goes directly against almost everything you've been taught in school and in society and in the media and everywhere else. Your obligation is to judge right and wrong for yourselves and to act accordingly. And if somebody says, no, 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 I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I'm authority, I lay down the law, you do this, you have the right to say, no, I'm not going to do the wrong thing just because the law tells me to. And when they huff and puff and say, you're nasty criminals and scofflaws and malcontents and horrible people that you would dare to disobey authority, you tell them, you're not the boss of me. Thank you.